What if this happens to you one silent night, sitting alone like Zach, questioning everything you believed, and suddenly the world itself seems to shift? Snow drifts over the town, soft and still, while inside, Zach clutches a faded photograph, years of regret and doubt pressing on him. The night hums with a presence beyond comprehension, and an impossible light bends shadows, illuminating spaces that should not exist. Jesus wasn't speaking in metaphors. The alien revealed what his words really pointed to. Tonight, Zach's disbelief becomes a signal, perception stretches, and reality begins to ripple in ways science cannot explain. Watch closely, stay until the end, and witness how ordinary life collides with extraordinary truth. Like, share, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Your presence matters. Step forward now, as centuries of misinterpretation unravel, and the hidden mechanics of Jesus' teachings reveal themselves. The journey into what humanity has long overlooked begins here. Zach was 70 years old and had arranged his life like a sealed room where nothing unexpected could enter. He woke before sunrise, brewed coffee measured to the same line on the mug, and sat in silence while the house listened with him. The rooms held the order of a man who trusted structure more than emotion. Books were aligned. Curtains were never drawn fully open. Clocks were synchronized. Even grief had been categorized and placed out of sight, or so he believed. He had once believed in God with the confidence of a child who assumes the floor will always be there. Church had been routine. Prayer had been habit. Scripture had been familiar as breathing. Then loss arrived without warning and without explanation. It did not feel meaningful. It did not feel designed. It felt random and indifferent. Zach did not rage publicly. He did not collapse. He simply concluded that the words he had trusted were empty. If the teachings were true, they should have worked when they were needed most. Since they did not, he filed them away with other disproven theories. Jesus, to Zach, became a historical figure whose language had been misunderstood and overpraised. Kingdom of heaven, light of the world, born again. All of it sounded poetic and vague, useful for comfort, perhaps, but useless for survival. Zach respected engineering, medicine, and measurable outcomes. He trusted what could be tested. He trusted what could be repeated. He trusted what did not ask for belief in exchange for silence. His days were quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. Retirement had not brought rest, only the slow stretching of hours with nothing demanding his attention. He filled the time with documentaries, news, and puzzles that required logic but no feeling. Yet something subtle had begun to shift. Not hope, but irritation. A recurring thought that arrived uninvited. A question he could not trace to any source. Why would words survive for 2,000 years if they were only decoration? Why would generations cling to metaphors unless something real pulsed beneath them? The thought unsettled him because it cracked the certainty he depended on. At night, when the house went still, the question returned. It did not feel like belief. It felt like pressure against a locked door. Zach did not know it yet, but his quiet was no longer unnoticed. Something had begun listening. The night arrived without ceremony, only the slow accumulation of wakefulness that left Zach staring at the ceiling while the house held its breath. Sleep did not refuse him loudly. It simply never came. Hours passed with the patience of something waiting. The clock glowed softly across the room, its light too dim to guide him yet too present to ignore, as though it existed solely to measure the distance between one thought and the next. Insomnia had become familiar since retirement, but this night carried a different weight. The air felt crowded. The silence did not feel empty. It felt attentive. Outside, the street was motionless, trees frozen in their own private listening, the sky clouded enough to hide the stars, yet thin enough to allow their suggestion. Nothing visible changed, yet Zach sensed the presence of a threshold, a moment balanced so carefully that any movement of the mind might tip it. He rose and moved through the house without turning on lights. Familiar pathways guided him through darkness. The kitchen, the hallway, the small back room where he sometimes stood to look out into the yard. Everything appeared ordinary, and that was precisely what unsettled him. The ordinary had begun to feel staged, as though the world had been arranged to resemble itself, while something unseen watched from behind the arrangement. He did not plan to speak. The words did not form through effort. They gathered slowly, like condensation, until silence could no longer hold them. The thought of ancient teachings, of promises that never manifested, of instructions that seemed beautiful yet impractical, all of it condensed into a single pressure behind his chest. When the words finally left him, they were not dramatic, they were not angry, they were tired. He acknowledged aloud that if any intelligence existed beyond the human frame, then the language preserved across centuries had failed him when clarity was most needed. The moment passed quickly. Nothing answered. No sound shifted. No light changed. The house remained still. Zach almost dismissed the impulse as another symptom of sleeplessness. Yet beneath the calm, something subtle altered. The quiet deepened rather than returned. It became layered, as if more than one silence now occupied the same space. The silence remained, heavier than before, as though awareness had shifted somewhere beyond him quietly. Somewhere beyond distance, attention settled and did not withdraw there. Light arrived without transition, as if the darkness had been edited rather than broken. The room did not brighten in the way lamps or lightning brightened a space. Instead, every surface gained definition at once. Edges sharpening, shadows thinning, air itself appearing slightly more present than it had been moments before. The change carried no sound, no hum, no vibration, only the quiet certainty that something impossible had just been introduced. Zach did not feel fear first. What came instead was disorientation, the kind that follows when the mind recognizes a pattern it has no category for. The house remained intact, yet the atmosphere no longer belonged exclusively to it. Through the back window, the yard appeared altered. The darkness had receded in a perfect circular boundary, as though night itself had stepped aside to make room. Beyond the glass, an object rested where empty air had existed seconds earlier. It did not descend. It did not land. It was simply present. Its form resisted comparison. Not metal, not stone, not anything reflective. Its surface absorbed light and returned a faint glow of its own, as though it existed slightly out of phase with the surrounding world. There were no seams, no visible structure, no suggestion of machinery. Only geometry too precise to be natural and too smooth to be built by human hands. The stillness deepened rather than shattered. The object did not announce itself. It did not demand attention. It waited. From within its surface, an opening formed without movement, material receding like a thought being withdrawn. From that absence, a figure emerged, tall, proportioned in a way that echoed humanity without belonging to it. Its presence carried no threat, no urgency, only a composure that felt older than instinct. Its form radiated clarity the way heat radiates from stone warmed by the sun long after the light has gone. Zach did not move. The moment did not feel like danger. It felt like precision. Like the exact second a long calculation resolves. The figure did not speak aloud, yet meaning settled into the space around Zach with unmistakable intent. It conveyed that it was known as Astro. It conveyed that this encounter was not corrective, not disciplinary, not random. It conveyed that the sleepless words spoken into the darkness had been received. The atmosphere seemed to hold that understanding care. That Zach was not punished. The presence that filled the room did not press against Zach. It clarified him. Thought slowed as if placed into a wider container, allowing each idea to unfold without collision. The figure beyond the window did not gesture or move, yet understanding continued to assemble with deliberate care, like architecture rising inside his awareness. The first realization did not feel like information. It felt like recognition. The being conveyed that the teacher Zach had dismissed had never spoken in riddles. The original statements were functional descriptions of how perception, attention, and coherence shaped reality. Over centuries, frightened institutions had softened those descriptions into poetry so that the mechanics would appear symbolic rather than operational. What survived as metaphor had once been instruction. This reframing struck with precision. Zach felt the mental structures he had built to protect himself begin to shift, not collapse, but realign. He had dismissed the language of Scripture because it seemed imprecise. Yet the message now suggested the opposite. The words had been too precise, too direct, too destabilizing for a culture that depended on obedience rather than self-mastery. The atmosphere around him thickened with implication. If the teachings were not decorative but technical, then their failure had not been inevitable. Their failure would mean they had been misapplied, mistranslated, or intentionally diluted. That possibility unsettled him more than the presence of the craft outside his home. It implied responsibility rather than randomness. A second understanding followed. The being conveyed that systems of belief had been constructed to manage behavior, not to cultivate awareness. Simpler stories traveled further. Symbols were safer than mechanics. Reverence was easier to control than comprehension. Over time, the original clarity had been replaced by layered interpretation until the living core had become almost unrecognizable. Zach experienced the sensation of standing before a sealed door he had passed every day without noticing. The door had always been there, hidden by familiarity. Now it appeared obvious, and the ignorance felt deliberate. His previous certainty fractured quietly, not into panic, but into a widening silence. The room seemed larger. The air seemed deeper. The world he thought he understood now appeared like a surface layer, concealing a complex structure beneath. The being did not instruct him to believe. It revealed a possibility that could not be unseen. It was the destabilization of a mind realizing it had been trained to misunderstand. The understanding continued to unfold with a calm that felt deliberate, as though each layer was offered only when Zach had space to hold it. The presence outside did not advance. It did not persuade. It simply clarified, and the clarity carried weight. What reached him next was the context of why this moment existed at all. He perceived that observation was constant, not only from this being but from others like it. Countless lives unfolding across the planet, each mind emitting patterns of fear, desire, distraction, and noise. The world, seen from beyond itself, resembled a field of static where coherence appeared only in brief and rare intervals. Billions lived their entire lives, never producing a signal distinct enough to register beyond their own nervous systems. Contact, he understood, was not a reward and not a selection. It was a consequence. When sincerity sharpened beyond self-performance, when attention stabilized without being forced, when inquiry was no longer fueled by ego but by exhaustion with illusion, a threshold was crossed. That threshold did not attract attention, it revealed it. Zach sensed that belief had never been the measure. Belief was easy. Belief could be inherited, borrowed, or performed. Readiness was different. Readiness required the collapse of narratives, the willingness to remain with uncertainty, the courage to question even the structures that once provided comfort. Sincerity was rarer still. It could not be rehearsed. It could not be simulated. It appeared only when a person had nothing left to defend. The awareness that this moment was not extraordinary to the observers unsettled him more than the presence itself. This was not an event. It was a response. The implication was subtle and immense. Others before him had reached this threshold. Others after him would reach it. The world had not changed because of them. The observers did not intervene. They confirmed, and they witnessed. Nothing more. That understanding stripped away any remaining sense of spectacle. There was no destiny in this, no assignment, no hidden role waiting to be fulfilled. Only a recognition that something in him had aligned with a deeper current, and that alignment had become perceptible beyond the boundaries he had assumed were absolute. The quiet remained. The presence remained. Not as a visitor, as acknowledgement. The moment hovered with restrained significance, neither promise nor threat, only a precise reflection of awareness finally meeting itself. The stillness altered again, not outwardly but internally, as though the architecture of attention itself had been touched. Zach perceived a compression of moments, a narrowing of the interval between thought and sensation. The room did not move, the air did not stir, yet the flow of experience shifted into a state that felt both slower and sharper, like a lens brought suddenly into perfect focus. Time did not stop. It thinned. The second hand on the clock across the room appeared suspended between movements, trembling within a fraction that extended far beyond its usual span. Within that suspended instant, Zach noticed details he had never perceived before. The grain of wood along the table revealed patterns like miniature landscapes. Dust motes in the air hung as if arranged rather than drifting. The hum of the refrigerator separated into layered tones, each vibration distinguishable, each rhythm precise. Then another layer unfolded. Alongside the familiar room existed a parallel texture, not visible in form but palpable in presence. The walls seemed to hold memory. The objects seemed to emit faint impressions of their histories. The chair carried the residue of countless evenings. The floor felt marked by years of footsteps. The world he had known as inert matter revealed itself as saturated with subtle information. The presence beyond the window did not command this shift. It facilitated it. Zach sensed that nothing external was being imposed. Instead, his own perception had been momentarily reorganized, allowing him to access strata of experience normally filtered out by the nervous system. The implication was unsettling. If this depth had always been present, then ordinary perception was not truth but compression. The suspended moment released gently. The clock resumed its rhythm. The dust resumed its drift. The refrigerator returned to a single, undifferentiated hum. Yet the memory of the expanded state did not fade. It lingered as certainty rather than imagination. Understanding assembled with quiet precision. What he had witnessed was not a miracle. It was a demonstration. Consciousness was not merely observing reality. It was shaping the slice of reality that could be accessed. The boundaries of experience were not fixed properties of the world but adjustable parameters within the observer. The room felt ordinary again, yet Zach sensed that ordinary was no longer trustworthy. The silence held a new density, patient and watchful, as if reality itself had noticed him fully. The room seemed unchanged, yet Zach felt its boundaries dissolve, not physically but conceptually, like the horizon of a dream stretching beyond expectation. The presence remained calm, patient, radiating a certainty that required neither explanation nor ceremony. Words arrived not from lips but from the subtle pressure of meaning, filling the spaces between thought with precise clarity. He understood that the phrase he had long dismissed as metaphor was literal in a way he had never imagined. The kingdom of God was not a location. It was not in the sky or beyond the stars. It was not a future reward or a judgment to be awaited. It was a layer of awareness, accessible from within. Consciousness itself was the interface, a gateway through which the structure of existence could be perceived, interpreted, and influenced. The implications pressed on him like water seeping through cracks in stone. For decades, he had accepted external markers as the measure of spiritual truth. Holy places, relics, rituals, sermons. He had assumed proximity to these objects altered understanding. Now, he realized the instruments of faith had always been approximations, shadows of a method that required no intermediary. The mechanics of reality had been misrepresented as poetry because humanity had feared the responsibility of accessing its own depths. He sensed the layers overlapping, not visible yet palpable. Each thought contained a resonance, each intention a ripple extending into unseen strata. Memory, emotion, and attention intertwined to form a map of influence rarely acknowledged by ordinary perception. Every human, if trained to recognize it, held the capacity to navigate these layers, to participate in the architecture of being, rather than to drift as passive observers. The presence did not lecture, did not insist, did not demand compliance. It merely conveyed what was always true and had always been ignored. Zach understood that the words preserved for 2,000 years were precise instructions, not figurative warnings. They had been coded for a culture capable of grasping the mechanics, yet diluted for safety, softened into allegory so that comprehension would not destabilize collective perception. The realization weighed upon him. The kingdom within was neither reward nor abstract promise. It was capacity. It was access. It was the acknowledgement that the world he experienced had always been filtered through the lens of his own awareness. And if that lens remained unexamined, the true structure of life remained invisible, a kingdom unseen despite existing eternally at the core of every consciousness. For the first time in decades, Zach sensed potential rather than emptiness, a depth beneath the routine, waiting quietly for acknowledgement. The moment arrived subtly, without fanfare or announcement, as if the world itself had stepped aside to allow perception to expand. Zach felt a gentle tug at the edges of his awareness, a sensation not of motion but of release. His body remained still in the chair, hands resting on knees, but consciousness loosened its attachment, no longer confined to skin and bone. He did not fall, he did not rise. He simply observed from a place both nearer and farther than he had ever known. Time became porous. Seconds lengthened, folded into themselves, revealing patterns he had never registered. The familiar sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the subtle creak of the floorboards, the distant wind brushing against the roof were filtered through a layer of perception that carried a new depth. Each vibration, each echo, each flicker of light seemed to contain more than its surface appearance. Awareness expanded sideways and backward and upward, tracing connections between moments, objects, and his own thoughts. It was not death. Zach did not feel absence or terror. He did not vanish. He felt the self he had always assumed was his identity. The body, the age, the years of isolation shift into perspective. The self was a lens, a container, a temporary interface for interaction with the world. What he had called his limitations, his failures, the weight of loss, now appeared as information passing through a system that could perceive far beyond the surface. He realized for the first time that the teacher he had dismissed had never pointed toward a destination outside the observer. Jesus had described states of being, thresholds of awareness, interfaces into reality that existed wherever consciousness allowed them to be. Life and death, gain and loss, joy and suffering, none were endpoints. They were the medium through which understanding unfolded. The room, the chair, even the night itself, became secondary to the clarity of the observation. Thoughts appeared as structures, emotions as energy, intentions as signals radiating outward. Every human experience was a coordinate in a multidimensional network of potential, and every mind had the capacity to perceive more than it allowed itself. Zach's awareness retracted gradually, returning to the body without abruptness, yet the impression remained indelible. He understood now that the self he had identified with for decades was a filter, not the essence. And in that understanding lay a quiet liberation, the first step toward perceiving the kingdom within and the mechanisms Jesus had described, patiently, for those ready to see. The air in the room thickened with unspoken gravity, the presence of the being outside pressing not on Zach's body but on his mind, reshaping the contours of thought he had long assumed fixed. Understanding arrived slowly, each idea unfolding like a carefully tuned instrument, resonating in frequencies he had never before considered. The silence of the house became the conduit, the medium through which meaning traveled without speech or gesture. He realized that the words of the teacher had never been vague. They had been precise, functional, operational. Every parable, every directive, every admonition carried a mechanism within it, a structure for perceiving reality and for interacting with the hidden layers of existence. The reason they had seemed enigmatic, incomprehensible, or symbolic was not due to inadequacy in the listener, but due to the absence of a conceptual framework capable of supporting their depth. Astro conveyed that humanity lacked the mental architecture to process the mechanics embedded in the instructions. Early minds had attempted to approximate understanding, filling gaps with ritual and repetition, creating forms that mimicked insight without grasping the underlying function. Meaning arrived, distorted, through generations, until the original clarity became obscured beneath layers of tradition, allegory, and faith as performance. Institutions did not create stories to preserve knowledge. They preserved them to simplify it, to convert precise mechanisms into symbols that could be taught without risk of destabilizing culture. Control, structure, and compliance replaced exploration, curiosity, and experiential understanding. The signal had been strong, but the channels had been muffled by fear, by governance, by the human tendency to protect comfort over comprehension. Zach felt the weight of this revelation settle. For decades he had believed that ambiguity in Scripture was inherent, a feature rather than a flaw. Now he understood that the ambiguity was imposed. Humanity had actively softened the teacher's language to make it digestible, safe, and repeatable. The genius had not been metaphorical. It had been destabilizing, dangerous, and transformative for those who could perceive its mechanics. The realization reverberated through him. What had been dismissed as poetic musing was a detailed map for navigating consciousness. What had been treated as guidance for obedience was a manual for accessing the hidden layers of existence. And the distortion, centuries deep, had created a world that mistook symbols for truth, ritual for understanding, and repetition for insight. Zach absorbed the implication with the slow, steady intensity of someone standing at the edge of a vast cliff, realizing that the landscape below had always existed, unseen, waiting for eyes ready to perceive. The room pulsed with an energy Zach could feel without naming, subtle but persistent, like the faint vibration of a tuning fork in the distance. The air was not moving, and yet his senses registered a coherence beyond anything he had ever experienced, as though a hidden lattice underlay the ordinary, rigid world he thought he knew. The presence of Astro did not intrude but radiated calm certainty. Each thought and intention precise, measured, and in alignment with the currents Zach could now sense. Astro's explanation arrived as a current rather than as speech, filling the spaces between cognition with the logic of experience. Faith was not belief, it was function. It was the coherence of the inner state, the alignment of attention, emotion, and intention with the structure of reality itself. Zach had long assumed that faith meant agreement with doctrine or the repetition of memorized words. He had assumed that belief was sufficient. Now he understood that belief without alignment was hollow, and that hollow belief distorted the lens through which the world appeared. He sensed the pattern of his own consciousness, tangled and frayed after decades of grief, habit, and isolation. Emotions unprocessed, intentions unexamined, judgments clung to him like static. This disorder created a filter, subtle and invisible, that warped perception and reinforced a sense of limitation. Moments of potential insight had been dulled by the disorganization within, and experiences he had interpreted as chance, as emptiness, as failure were in part reflections of this inner misalignment. Astro did not demonstrate with words, but with perception. Time slowed slightly, and Zack noticed the contours of the room sharpen, the space between objects revealing traces of energy he had never perceived. The ceiling, the walls, even the faint outlines of furniture carried resonance, echoes of intention and attention that mirrored his inner state. When his mind wavered, the clarity dissolved. The same world that appeared solid moments before fractured into ambiguity, subtle distortions appearing like cracks in glass. When his mind stabilized, when his attention aligned with his emotional clarity, the room cohered once more, entire and precise. Zack felt the implication like a weight pressing at the base of his skull. Faith was functional. It was an operational calibration of perception. Emotional coherence did not require certainty about unseen forces. It required acknowledgement of experience, integration of memory, acceptance of grief, and alignment of intention with clarity rather than avoidance. Disorganization of emotion translated directly into distortion of perception. Chaos within birthed chaos without. Understanding this, he realized, was not optional. It was the instruction that had been encoded in the teacher's words, misrepresented over centuries, reduced to parables and metaphors for those unprepared to process the mechanics. The revelation settled into him slowly, settling not as explanation but as potential. If his inner state could stabilize, the world would not change because of force or miracle, but because perception itself would become accurate. He sensed a responsibility unlike any he had known. The function of faith was not passive, it was an active interface. An ongoing calibration of the self to perceive clearly, to navigate existence with precision. He understood for the first time that alignment of the inner state was the doorway to everything the teacher had described. The mechanics had been encoded in every instruction, every parable, every insistence on presence and attention, waiting for someone ready enough to grasp that function was the truth, and that belief alone had never been enough. Memories arrived unbidden, slipping through the edges of Zack's mind like water through cracks in stone. He saw himself at 53, sitting in a small church on a cold Sunday morning, listening to words he had once dismissed as parables. They were sharp, precise, almost mechanical, like instructions for assembling something invisible. He had felt a flicker of recognition, a tension in the chest that whispered of possibility. And then he had turned away. He had rationalized the feeling, silenced it, convinced himself that the moment was insignificant, that ordinary life required ordinary perception. Another memory emerged. He was 47, walking alone along the river after the death of his father. The sky stretched in clarity, a faint wind stirring the branches, and he remembered thinking that everything he had been taught about life, about purpose, about right action, felt incomplete. Words he had heard in childhood, now forgotten, resurfaced in fragments, precise and functional, yet he had shoved them aside, preferring the comfortable certainty of routine, of measured expectation. He had not wanted responsibility, had not wanted to confront the depths that understanding demanded. The pattern grew. Decades of subtle avoidance unfolded before him like a map of lost opportunity. He remembered the nights he sat by the window after Mary had passed, staring at darkness, thinking about teachings he had studied and dismissed. He had argued with himself that interpretation mattered, that metaphor was sufficient, that the wisdom of the ages was inaccessible to someone like him. Yet now he understood that those moments had been invitations, precise, actionable, and completely ignored. Astro's presence, quiet and unwavering, allowed him to witness without judgment. The being's awareness, expansive yet patient, seemed to hold the full spectrum of his life in a single sweep, highlighting not only what had been lost but what had been available all along. The words he had mocked, the passages he had ignored, the lessons he had rationalized into vagueness were not abstract. They were instructions, maps of action for the alignment of perception, for the calibration of consciousness. Every avoidance, every rationalization, every refusal to engage had created ripples of delay, subtle but cumulative, keeping him distant from a functional understanding that was always within reach. He felt the weight of his own agency, the decades of avoidance pressing like a shadow at the edge of awareness. And yet, the sensation was not despair. It was recognition. Understanding that for all the years he had wandered in narrow corridors of thought and habit, the instructions had never disappeared. They had always been present, waiting for the moment when he could receive them fully. The realization carried a strange combination of regret and relief. The knowledge that lost years were indeed lost, yet that the mechanism for recovery had always been accessible. Zach understood for the first time that Jesus' words had not been vague or mystical. They had been precise operational commands, clear directives for the functioning of consciousness. The lost years were a record of avoidance, of failure to engage, yet also a map showing where understanding had waited silently for readiness. In that recognition, the possibility of alignment began to stir, a potential that had been present all along, now opening with subtle insistence. The past was no longer only a burden, it was a guide. The stillness in the room thickened, a palpable quiet that pressed against Zach's awareness in a way he had never encountered. The light that shimmered from Astro's form was gentle, steady, almost liquid in its consistency, yet it carried weight, a subtle authority that made the boundaries of the room feel both larger and smaller at once. Zach understood that this was not theatrics, not a performance designed to impress or frighten. This was reality exposed in its most fundamental function, and his mind, though resistant, began to stretch toward comprehension. Astro's voice entered not through ears but through thought, direct and clear, a current running through Zach's consciousness. Observers do not interfere, the being explained. They do not save. They do not guide. Intervention is rare because interference carries consequences that ripple far beyond perception, far beyond what humans can calculate. Their presence is not mercy or judgment. It is measurement. Observation is the mechanism through which thresholds are confirmed, moments of awakening detected, and potential recorded. Rare individuals, those whose awareness pierces the habitual veil of human limitation, create signals strong enough to resonate across dimensions, across levels of perception that normally remain dormant. Zach felt the statement as a vibration rather than as information. His own life, the patterns of avoidance, the moments he had recognized and ignored, all seemed to resonate with the concept. The rare alignment of attention, emotion, and perception he had glimpsed in flashes over decades had now been registered. The observers had noticed. The acknowledgement was not comfort, not accolade, not reassurance in the ordinary sense. It was confirmation that when consciousness reaches specific thresholds, it produces measurable reality shifts. Subtle yet undeniable. That was the function of observation, the principle of existence beyond ordinary sight. The realization unsettled him. All the stories he had been told about divine intervention, salvation, miraculous guidance, now appeared as human constructions, approximations of understanding packaged for comfort, for control, for obedience. The teacher's words had never promised rescue. They had designed mechanisms, instructions for operating consciousness at its peak potential. Observation was the mirror of those mechanisms, an external measure, silent, patient, waiting for the individual to activate the interface of understanding. Zach perceived the paradox. Humans demand guidance, yet awakening is only measured when they act without it, when insight arises independently of expectation. To be observed was not to be privileged. It was to be tested by existence itself. The rare individual who activates these thresholds does not receive intervention, only confirmation, a record that consciousness has aligned, that perception has reached a functional clarity capable of reshaping reality from within. He understood now that his years of struggle, grief, and avoidance had created patterns, some dormant, some active, which either obstructed or amplified these thresholds. His own awakening, subtle yet undeniable, had drawn the observer's attention. There was no reward. There was no instruction manual. There was only the acknowledgement that the machinery of consciousness, when engaged fully, functioned as intended. And in that acknowledgement, Zach felt both the gravity of responsibility and the quiet pulse of possibility, a current he had never before allowed himself to recognize. Awareness shifted in a way Zach could not anticipate, as if the walls of the room, the gravity that pressed against his body, and the air that carried faint particles of warmth had all softened their boundaries. He felt the space between things dissolve, the distinctions that had once seemed absolute between self and other, inside and outside, past and present, sliding into continuity. It was not a dream. It was not imagination. It was perceptual, immediate, undeniable. The small room expanded infinitely, not in distance, but in density of connection. Every molecule, every shadow, every thread of sound hummed with relevance, each resonating in subtle synchrony with the currents he now felt flowing through himself. Astro's presence was steady, not directing, not framing, but allowing. You are not separate, the being transmitted. Not in metaphor, not in suggestion, not spiritually or poetically. In fact, the words themselves were inadequate. What you perceive as separation is a construct, a convenient illusion created by habitual cognition. Your body, your thoughts, your emotions, your memories, they are instruments of interface, not limitations. They filter reality into distinct fragments, but the underlying substrate is continuous. It has always been continuous, and now you feel it. Zach's perception rippled outward, a subtle awareness threading through the furniture, the floorboards, the air, moving through the skin, through the blood, merging without dissolution. The snow outside was not distant. Its crystalline structure vibrated faintly in resonance with him. The stars beyond the roofline were not points of light. They were pulsations in the same continuum, patterns of energy folding into one another in ways he had never imagined. Even time seemed to bend, not as linear sequence, but as layered simultaneity, every moment influencing every other in subtle harmonics he had not previously perceived. He recognized that the boundaries he had always assumed to be immutable, between self and world, between life and death, between awareness and unconsciousness, were porous and functional. To act within them as though they were absolute had consequences. To live believing they were walls had limited everything he thought he could know. Now the walls had become instruments, guides, reference points within a broader, inseparable system. He felt the pulse of the planet beneath him, the rotation, the gravitational whisper, the subtle flow of energy through trees, through wind, through soil, through light. It was not communion. It was observation, direct perception of structure and continuity. Astro allowed silence to settle around him, the awareness unbroken, neither imposing nor commanding. You are never separate, the transmission continued, only unaware. Consciousness experiences fragment to navigate complexity, but the substrate is whole. And when you align with that substrate, even partially, your perception becomes functional rather than reactive. Zach felt a tremor of exhilaration, a realization that he had walked his life thinking of boundaries as absolutes, walls as definitions. And now he perceived a system so vast that every decision, every hesitation, every intention vibrated outward, intertwined with currents he had never recognized. He understood that this was not insight in words, not revelation in symbols. It was perception recalibrated, a subtle, ongoing recognition that he was neither observer nor observed but an integrated node within an immense, continuous, living pattern. For the first time in decades, his own thoughts and presence felt neither isolated nor burdensome. They were functional, necessary, and inseparable from the larger flow. In that recognition, the seed of alignment had been planted, the threshold for understanding what the teacher had encoded now partially unlocked, ready for further activation. Zach felt the concept settle into him slowly, like a dense liquid finding its level. The stories he had heard all his life, the miracles, the healings, the sudden restorations of sight or movement shifted from myth to function. They were not exceptions to natural law. They were demonstrations of a mechanism long ignored. Miracles were not displays of divine whim or selective benevolence. They were interactions between consciousness and the body, the mind and the environment, governed by principles that humanity had misread as magic because comprehension had not yet matured. Astro's presence illuminated the principle without urgency or drama. People healed not because they had invoked divine favor in the conventional sense, but because they had reached a state of alignment with a coherent internal frequency. Jesus, the being explained, maintained an internal field of stability, a structured coherence in thought, emotion, and intent that radiated outward. Those who entered that field in receptive states, whose internal systems resonated with the pattern, experienced physiological harmonization. Their hearts, their nervous systems, their cells responded in kind. The body, no longer dissonant with the underlying resonance, shifted toward optimal function. Zach remembered countless accounts, the blind seeing, the crippled walking, the fevered calming, and realized that what had seemed impossible had always operated on principle. Faith was not belief. Faith was functional alignment. Synchronization was the operative word. Your faith healed you, he thought. But now, the meaning deepened. It was not about words uttered, not about recitation or ritual, not about petition or hope. It was about the inner state, the coherence that allowed the body to access processes normally constrained by disarray, by emotional turbulence, by fragmented perception. He recognized echoes of this principle in his own life, moments of sudden clarity, rare periods where he had acted with precision, thought without hesitation, moved without distraction. In those moments, subtle things had changed. Objects seemed more responsive, people more perceptive, events unfolding in patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. They had been micro-demonstrations of the same principle, hints of alignment, fragments of the mechanism Jesus had used on a larger scale. The realization unsettled him. The implications were enormous. Healing was not an act performed on someone else. It was a resonance interaction. The supposed miracle worker did not impose change. The worker embodied a coherent interface that allowed the receiver to access latent potentials. The words spoken, the gestures made, the presence offered were only instruments to maintain the internal structure necessary for synchronization to propagate. Zach felt a shiver of both awe and apprehension. Humanity had interpreted these events as supernatural, cloaking operational precision in mythology, diluting function into faith narratives. He understood that much of human confusion about power, about divinity, about intervention, arose from mistaking the instrument for the phenomenon. The truth had always been practical, but without comprehension, it became mystical. He sensed that the same principle applied more broadly than he had imagined. The alignment that produced healings was the same principle underlying influence, communication, and perception itself. Awareness structured in a coherent, undistracted, and receptive manner could shape experience, synchronize phenomena, and unlock potential otherwise dormant. He realized that the stories were instructions disguised as narrative, that miracles had been functional templates for consciousness in motion, and that understanding the mechanism, even partially, shifted the threshold for what was possible in every moment. Zack felt the weight of this knowledge settle against him, neither oppressive nor comforting. It was responsibility without prescription, revelation without ceremony, a mechanism waiting for engagement, and he knew that he had only begun to perceive its edges. The interface between coherence and effect had been exposed, and the doorway to understanding had swung open, just slightly, for him to step through. The room felt heavier, charged not with light, but with the weight of withheld understanding. Zack sensed that what Astra was about to explain was not a matter of history or doctrine, but of consequence, of subtle design operating across millennia. The air itself seemed to ripple with a quiet insistence, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for him to perceive something beyond comprehension. He understood instinctively that this chapter of Revelation would fracture assumptions he had carried for decades, assumptions he had trusted because they were simple, comforting, contained. Astra communicated without gesture, without speech. The words entered directly into perception, layered over Zack's consciousness in a way that left no room for doubt. Only gradual assimilation. Humanity was observed continuously, the being said, and civilization was fragile. Exposure to certain knowledge, unmediated, created consequences that were often invisible until too late. Premature understanding, the kind that bypassed stages of cognitive readiness, amplified ego. It magnified fear. It intensified the drive for control. People armed with comprehension before integration misapplied it, creating disorder rather than insight. Truth without structure became chaos. Zack felt the implication pressing inward. The miraculous teachings, the stories, the words of Jesus had been carefully veiled. They were encoded not to obscure meaning arbitrarily, but to maintain systemic stability. Civilization, when faced with knowledge of consciousness as a functional interface, risked using it to dominate, to manipulate, to fragment society along lines of power rather than alignment. The mechanisms that allowed healing, influence, and perception shaping were precise, delicate, and responsive. In untrained hands, they produced distortion, suffering, and imbalance. Religion, the being explained, had evolved as a proxy. Its symbols, rituals, narratives, and hierarchies had encoded principles too potent to be revealed openly. Faith, obedience, ceremony, all were filters, protective frameworks, containment fields designed to translate functional mechanics into digestible experience. The translation was imperfect. It obscured subtlety, generated dogma, and inevitably created myths and moral imperatives. Yet the distortion served a purpose. It preserved the potential for awakening while limiting the risk of catastrophic misuse. Zack realized that the suppression was not malevolent. It was defensive. The distortion was necessary because human consciousness, for all its brilliance, lacked the systemic maturity to handle the mechanics without collateral damage. Premature knowledge would trigger egoistic manipulation, social destabilization, and profound suffering. The truths Jesus demonstrated, the principles he encoded into words and actions, were meant to awaken, not dominate. They were keys to perception, tools for alignment, not weapons of control. The revelation settled across Zack like a tide. The confusion he had long carried, the contradiction between promise and reality, the failure of faith to heal, the cruelty he had observed in the world now made sense in functional terms. Misunderstanding was not a flaw in human devotion. It was a safeguard, a layer of protection, a bridge between capacity and readiness. The words of Jesus had always been precise, but the society around them had lacked the conceptual infrastructure to integrate them safely. Knowledge had been hidden, not stolen, not corrupted, but contained, waiting for the rare individual capable of aligning perception, intention, and presence without unraveling the system. Zack absorbed the weight of it, the simultaneous precision and subtlety, the immense foresight embedded in the seeming contradictions. He understood for the first time that concealment was itself a form of care, that distortion was preservation, and that awakening demanded both courage and readiness. He realized that he had been drawn to this moment, not by chance, but by signal, by resonance, by alignment, and within that recognition, a deep stillness settled. The awareness of responsibility, the quiet acknowledgement that comprehension, even partial, altered the landscape of what was possible. Zach felt the words settle like sediment in still water, each one clarifying the patterns he had glimpsed but never fully understood. The alien's presence, calm and unwavering, filled the space around him with a weight that was not oppressive but exacting, as though every detail of perception was being measured, assessed, aligned. The question that had haunted him for decades, the why of his isolation, the why of his suffering, the why of his restless search, began to find a quiet answer in the spaces between Astro's explanations. The being conveyed without embellishment. Billions were observed, but almost none were truly perceptible. Observation alone did not invite engagement. Engagement required a signal, a resonance that could not be faked, that could not be manufactured through performance, ambition, or expectation. It was the quality of the seeker that mattered, not the volume of the plea. Zach realized slowly that he had never sought influence, never desired status, never claimed to carry a mission beyond understanding. His questions had been private, raw, insistent, and free of ulterior motives. He had only wanted clarity, and in that purity, he had generated a signal strong enough to cross dimensions, to reach those who watched patiently, calculating the readiness of the observer. Astro's presence framed the concept in a perceptual geometry beyond words. The clarity of purpose, untainted by ego, created a kind of resonance that amplified visibility. Zach's sincerity had been a beacon, though he had not recognized it as such, though it had always felt like loneliness, like frustration, like a quiet despair at the inadequacy of the world around him. The very traits he had scorned in himself, the resistance to conventional comfort, the refusal to bow to expectation, the persistent scrutiny of claims he could not reconcile, were precisely what rendered him perceivable to forces that did not operate by ordinary laws. The revelation was unsettling because it inverted everything he had assumed about worthiness, about access, about selection. It was not deeds, titles, or ritual that mattered. It was alignment, intentionality, the unswerving devotion to truth as he perceived it. That singular quality, undiluted by ambition or desire for recognition, had drawn attention. It was why he had been singled out, why the signal of his anguish and inquiry had penetrated the usual layers of noise and distraction that obscured most of humanity from observation. Zach's mind turned inward, tracing decades of solitude, every private question asked at midnight, every moment of existential wrestling, every time he had sought evidence rather than comfort. Each instance now registered as an incremental calibration, a preparation, an unconscious tuning of awareness that had positioned him as an appropriate vessel for revelation. He recognized that contact had not been random, that his suffering had not been accidental, and that his solitude had served a hidden purpose. The mechanisms of selection were subtle, deliberate, and precise, and he had been measured with care, evaluated not by performance, but by the integrity of his engagement with reality. Astro's presence conveyed the final nuance. Perception itself was both a threshold and a filter. Those who reached the necessary clarity could witness the layers that underlie the world, the truths embedded in events, words, and human actions. Zach understood, without needing to articulate it, that he had been brought here not to act, not to preach, not to perform miracles, but simply to perceive. In that perception lay responsibility, potential, and revelation. He was contactable because he sought only truth, and truth, unmediated by ambition or ego, had recognized him. The silence after Astro's statement pressed against Zach in a way that was almost physical, as if the air itself had mass and expectation. There was no projection of images, no alteration of reality, no immediate revelation of truths hidden from humanity. There was only him, the room, and the quiet insistence that something within needed to be faced. He realized slowly that the test was not about comprehension or intellect. Knowledge alone had no weight here. The threshold was not external, it was internal, raw, and unflinching. Zach felt a tremor pass through his consciousness, the kind that comes when one senses a boundary inside themselves, an edge of avoidance or denial that has been carried for decades. The being did not speak, did not guide. The words already spoken hung in the atmosphere like distant stars, principles laid out and available. Now it was him, and the memory that had shadowed his nights, the echo that had made laughter hollow and comfort transient. It was the wound he had buried under schedules, routine, and the illusion of reason. It was the absence he had learned to carry with stiff shoulders, the unfinished sentences, the moments of silence he had convinced himself did not matter. The room seemed to contract around the awareness of the wound. Zach felt the weight of it in his chest, a tightness that had always been rationalized as fatigue, as caution, as experience. Now the rationalizations fell away like brittle leaves. There was only the raw, unmediated presence of what he had refused to touch. The loss, the regret, the small betrayals of self against the self, the ways in which he had chosen inaction over engagement, in silence over speech, in fear over vulnerability. All of it gathered in a single point, sharp and undeniable. Astro's presence was a mirror without distortion, reflecting not what Zach wanted to see, but what had always been. The alien conveyed, not through words, but through perception itself, the imperative that awareness without embodiment is hollow. Knowing something intellectually, even fully, does not alter the architecture of experience unless it is felt, held, and acknowledged in the body, in the memory, in the heart that had learned to avoid itself. Zach's life, for all its routines and careful observation of detail, had been a deflection. His awareness had remained external, analytical, protective, never fully landing in the soil of his own pain. Hours passed, though they had no measure. Zach sat with the wound, naming it internally, allowing the memory to breathe in his attention. The shame, the guilt, the moments he had judged as failures. Each presented itself as a teaching rather than condemnation. He felt the weight of avoidance lift incrementally, replaced by something stranger, something like gravity being rebalanced. The air shifted, not with light or sound, but with the sensation of recognition. Awareness was no longer a concept. It was a presence in his chest, a warmth in his hands, a light in his eyes that had nothing to do with the ship or the being, and everything to do with the interior landscape he had avoided for decades. By the time the silence ended, Zach understood. The test had never been about acquisition, about learning another layer of truth. It had been about inhabiting the truth he had always carried, about facing the fracture he had refused to acknowledge. And in that confrontation, he felt the first pulse of something beyond mere comprehension. A resonance that aligned perception, emotion, and being. The wound was still present, but it no longer held him hostage. He could see it. He could feel it. And in that integration, he sensed a threshold opening, a space in which knowledge could finally become alive. The quiet glow of the ship, once a balm, now felt like a mirror reflecting the fissures Zach had thought he had repaired. The warmth that had accompanied his first confrontation with the wound seemed to slip like water through fingers, leaving behind the familiar chill of old habits and unexamined patterns. His mind, restless as ever, began to wander into the corridors of frustration, revisiting decades of avoidance and self-criticism, and he felt the old familiar weight of shame descend. Every logical argument he had ever constructed to explain his isolation, Every rationalization for why he had withheld his presence or his emotions now seemed insufficient, inadequate, hollow. In the recesses of his awareness, he recognized the pattern. A brief surge of insight, a glimpse of clarity, and then a retreat into comfort zones, into the analytical cages he had built to protect himself. The resonance of his own emotional avoidance was magnetic. He realized that despite the revelation, despite the presence of Astro and the impossibility of what had been shown, he was repeating old behaviors, rehearsing the same protective habits that had kept him safe but inert for decades. Frustration rose, hot and sharp, accompanied by the corrosive voice of internal judgment. Why couldn't he sustain it? Why did he stumble where understanding had promised elevation? Astro's presence remained calm, a constant against the turbulence of Zach's internal storm. There were no words at first, only a perception of attention, as if the being itself was a field of observation that held him accountable without interference. Then the communication emerged, not as critique, but as principle, a telepathic pulse that cut through the noise of self-recrimination. Awareness is chosen repeatedly, not achieved once. The statement echoed through the architecture of his perception, simple in words but immense in implication. The path was not linear, the lesson not a single acquisition. Consciousness, like any living system, required continual engagement, repeated calibration, and acceptance of failure as an integral part of growth. Zach felt resistance in his chest, a mixture of exasperation and recognition. His mind argued with itself, citing reason, habit, fatigue. Yet beneath the surface, a part of him recognized the truth of the statement. Growth was not a moment. It was iterative, cyclical, a pattern of falling, rising, and choosing again. He saw the landscape of his own life in a new light. The decades of retreat and avoidance were not proof of failure in the ultimate sense, but evidence of a system still learning, still calibrating, still capable of orientation toward insight when confronted with the persistent choice to engage. The tension in his body began to release, not fully, but perceptibly, as if even the muscles, attuned to avoidance, were acknowledging the principle. The glow around him shifted subtly, no longer a passive illumination but a reflection of internal recognition, a perceptual marker of the threshold between inertia and engagement. Zach understood that shame and frustration were not obstacles to be eliminated, but signals, indicators of repeated neglect that must be met with attention and resolve. The lesson was precise, exacting, and entirely his responsibility. By the end of the interval, he felt something fragile, a flicker of willingness, a readiness to attempt again, to inhabit awareness not as an idealized state to be achieved once but as a continuous, repeated practice. Failure was no longer an endpoint. It was a pulse in the system, a rhythm that could guide, not hinder, as long as he kept choosing, over and over. The presence of consciousness in every action, every thought, every emotion. The door to growth had not opened fully, but its frame was visible, and Zach could see the path, iterative and demanding, stretching outward beyond the boundaries of his old, constricted life. The silence inside the ship was no longer oppressive. It was a presence, a field of possibility in which Zach discovered a new rhythm, subtle and unforced. The old impulses to argue, to rationalize, to defend every lapse of perception no longer commanded the attention they once had. He realized that he could notice the discomfort rising in his chest without needing to flee from it, that he could allow the weight of unresolved emotions to exist alongside him without letting them dictate action or judgment. The body still whispered familiar fears, the mind still circled familiar regrets, but he met them differently. He did not retreat, he did not constrict. He simply observed, allowing the sensation of presence to anchor him in a clarity that had once seemed impossible. Astro's form remained luminous, still, precise, and patient. The alien did not instruct, did not admonish. Its quiet existence, its unwavering attention, provided a space in which Zach could witness himself without distortion. And in this witnessing, a subtle transformation began. The mental clutter, the compulsion to measure worth against past failures, the endless debate over what was correct or deserved, all began to lose volume. A different kind of resonance appeared, an internal frequency not tied to achievement or avoidance, but to simple acknowledgement. To be present was enough. To observe without judgment was a function as powerful and precise as any act of reason, more exact than any calculation his mind could produce. He felt the first tremors of a shift, imperceptible at first, like the slow settling of sediment in water. The clarity was not bright or dramatic. It was quiet, deep, stabilizing, like the foundation of a house that had long been shaken by storms. For the first time in decades, he realized that understanding could coexist with uncertainty, that comprehension was not a demand for immediate action or a verdict of self-worth. He could sit in the tension, feel it, and remain intact. The sensation extended beyond thought, moving into perception, into the subtle architecture of his awareness. He was beginning to sense the continuity of experience, how emotion, thought, and perception interlaced into a coherent field when approached without resistance. Astro's communication, subtle and ineffable, seemed to acknowledge the change without recognition or reward. There was no applause, no affirmation, only the quiet resonance of alignment. Zach felt the presence of patience, of an intelligence that did not intervene but allowed space for emergence. The realization settled in. The shift was not about accomplishment, about understanding the alien, or about mastering knowledge. It was about the simple practice of staying, of choosing to inhabit the moment fully, regardless of discomfort, of resisting the habitual retreat into defense or analysis. The shift carried implications that were both profound and unsettling. Zach understood that every familiar reflex, every repeated pattern of avoidance, could now be met with attention instead of reaction. He felt the stability of clarity as a physical weight, grounding him, shaping the perception of time, of space, of self. It was a clarity that required no explanation, that carried no narrative, that simply existed as the presence of awareness itself. In that space, he discovered the subtle power of embodiment. Awareness was no longer theoretical, no longer an abstract principle to be studied or measured. It was a current running through his perception, threading together past, present, and possibility. The discomfort remained, but it no longer dictated action. He could move through it, not around it, not away from it. The shift was complete in its inception, a quiet yet irreversible realignment of the inner field. Zach understood, without words, that the path forward would be measured in repeated choices, in the ongoing cultivation of presence, and that the door to deeper comprehension had opened simply because he had chosen to remain fully in the luminous tension of now. The ship's ambient light had shifted into a gentle undulation, a rhythm that seemed tied not to machinery but to perception itself. Zach felt it first as a subtle vibration under his feet, then as a soft resonance in the edges of his awareness. He could sense the quiet order beneath the apparent randomness of thought, emotion, and memory. In this space, stillness was no longer a suggestion or a refuge. It was a medium, a conduit through which perception extended into layers previously inaccessible, layers in which clarity was not earned through effort, but discovered through suspension of resistance. Astro's presence, luminous and steady, communicated without urgency. Zach understood without words that the stillness he had once sought in meditation, in avoidance, in ritual, had always been incomplete. He had mistaken quiet for comprehension, absence of noise for clarity. Now, the stillness was active. expansive, like a lens aligning itself naturally to the contours of reality. Every thought, every impulse, every tremor of frustration or desire was observed and contained without interference, without the necessity to manipulate or interpret. He began to perceive the subtle interweaving of consciousness and the structures beneath it, a lattice of perception and resonance connecting all things, a field that was both intimate and vast. Astro's communication became perceptible as a precise calibration of thought and feeling. Be still and know that I am God. Zach realized he had never understood the statement literally, never grasped that stillness was not about ceasing activity but about ceasing resistance, about aligning the internal frequency to the rhythm of the underlying layer of reality. The words had been an instruction, not a metaphor, a practical guide to accessing the deeper mechanics of existence that his intellect had failed to decode for decades. Stillness allowed observation without distortion, awareness without judgment, and presence without fragmentation. He sensed the implication in his own life, in every memory that had accumulated as pain, every regret, every unspoken word, every habitual defense. The stillness he now inhabited revealed the subtle currents beneath these patterns. They were not chains, but signals, indicators of alignment or misalignment between consciousness and the deeper layer. He could feel them, not as abstractions, not as moral lessons, but as real pressures, real vibrations, real tendencies that shaped experience when left unobserved or resisted. Awareness of these currents allowed choice, and choice, when anchored in stillness, stabilized perception and opened the possibility of action unmediated by fear or ego. Zach felt the field extend beyond himself, his body becoming a node in a lattice that connected to the environment, to the ship, to Astro, and to something immeasurable beyond. Stillness was no longer passive. It was perceptual power. It was understanding without thought. He understood that every word of Jesus, every teaching that had been dismissed or misread, pointed to the same principle. Presence, calibrated to the deeper layer. Awareness maintained in the absence of distraction. Clarity generated through suspension of habitual interference. Time itself seemed to stretch, not as a measure but as a medium in which perception expanded. Zach understood that stillness was both the path and the proof, both the method and the manifestation. In this silence, he glimpsed the continuity of existence beneath personal narrative, beneath memory, beneath desire. The teaching was simple, deceptively so, yet its execution demanded surrender, repetition, and precision. And for the first time, he felt that surrender was not weakness, that repetition was not failure, that precision was not rigidity. It was engagement with the mechanics of reality itself, and in that engagement, he perceived the possibility of a life unfragmented, a consciousness aligned, a being attuned to the field beneath appearances. Stillness was no longer an ideal. It was the medium through which he could finally see. The glow of the ship softened, no longer pulsing in deliberate rhythm but blending into the darkness around the yard, as though it had never been there at all. Zach remained rooted in the snow, feeling the residual warmth under his feet where the craft had hovered, a trace of presence that was no longer tangible yet impossible to dismiss. The night was still, almost unbearably so, but it was not the silence of absence. It was silence charged with subtle movement, a faint tremor beneath reality, a quiet that vibrated with everything he had just witnessed. Astro's voice, though gone from the air, lingered in the folds of his mind, precise, calm, and insistent, a reminder that perception, once aligned, remained regardless of proximity. You were never selected, you aligned yourself. Zach replayed the words, letting them turn over and over like stones in a stream. Selection implied judgment, hierarchy, distance. Alignment suggested choice, responsibility, presence. He He realized the shift, the subtle yet profound change in his understanding of causality, influence, and participation. He had not been chosen because he was special in the way humans measure specialness. He had been perceptible because he had sought truth without manipulation, had voiced pain without adornment, had confronted loss without distraction. The mechanics of awareness, once activated, had registered a resonance that nothing external could fabricate. He understood that alignment was not granted. It was recognized, not as a reward, but as confirmation of a threshold crossed. The yard felt different now. The snow reflected moonlight with a clarity that seemed to emerge from its own depth rather than from the moon above. The trees seemed less separate, their boughs not merely objects but part of a continuity that extended through Zach, the house, and the landscape. He felt his breathing, not as a private function but as a rhythm of connection, each inhale and exhale interacting with the currents of the world. The temporal order he had taken for granted, the strict compartmentalization of past, present, and future, began to soften. Memories of loss, regret, and avoidance shifted in tone. They remained, yet the weight they carried was altered, filtered through a lens of recognition rather than self-condemnation. He did not turn to see the ship vanish. Its disappearance was not a spectacle. There was no roar, no flash, no gesture of drama. He did not need confirmation. Its absence confirmed what had always been true. The observer had never imposed itself. It had merely reflected, recorded, and demonstrated. The encounter had not rewritten reality. It had reframed the terms by which reality could be perceived, showing him the consequences of clarity, the mechanics of alignment, and the difference between understanding as concept and understanding as lived awareness. Zach stood in the snow, chest heavy yet unburdened, feeling a continuity that extended through time and space, a field of presence that did not demand action or applause. The night had shifted. The world had not changed, but he had. The departure was not a loss, but a punctuation, a silent acknowledgement that what he now carried, invisible yet tangible, required no external validation. Alignment, he understood, was not a state to be achieved once, but a way to inhabit every moment, to witness without interference, to exist without separation. He exhaled, sensing the faint echo of Astro's guidance in the quiet between heartbeats. The observer had gone, but the observation remained, woven into the subtle architecture of awareness, marking the threshold beyond which he had finally stepped. The first sunrise after the encounter came without fanfare, yet it carried a weight that Zach could feel in the marrow of his bones. Light spilled across the yard, across the still frozen snow, and he noticed, for the first time in decades, the subtle gradient of color within each shadow. It was not merely brightness or warmth, it was information, a texture of existence that had always been present but had previously escaped his perception. Zach moved slowly, deliberately, tasting the rhythm of each step as if the ground itself whispered continuity beneath his feet. The air seemed thicker, richer, carrying nuances of scent and temperature that he had ignored in a life measured by routine and expectation. He did not speak at length to anyone that morning. The phone calls went unanswered. Emails lingered in their drafts. There was no urgency to share the revelation, no compulsion to convince. The usual weight of justification, of defending his beliefs or disproving others, had evaporated. He sat with his breakfast, observing the light shifting across the table, noticing the subtle warmth of the cup in his hands, the faint scent of roasted coffee beans. The mundane details of life, once invisible in their ordinariness, were now saturated with significance, each a node in an intricate network of perception that extended far beyond his former understanding. He walked through his neighborhood later, noticing the rhythm of life as though listening for an underlying pattern rather than the narrative of gossip or obligation. A dog barked in the distance, yet the sound was not merely noise. It resonated with the energy of its source, its intention, its placement in the field of awareness that connected Zach to the world around him. Children ran past, unaware of his observation, yet their movement, their energy, threaded through the air like invisible filaments connecting everything in motion. Zach felt no need to intervene or interpret. He simply allowed presence to register itself, a witness without judgment, a mind unencumbered by habitual analysis or critique. Even memories that once haunted him no longer imposed guilt. The 3 decades of missed opportunities, harsh words, and silent regrets remained. Yet they were filtered through something new: clarity of perception, the subtle recognition that every thought, every action, had been a manifestation of his state at that moment. Mistakes were not erased, but their weight had shifted. They were threads in a larger tapestry he could now observe without distortion. Zach noticed his own body differently. Breathing was no longer automatic. Each inhale and exhale conveyed information about balance, tension, energy flow. Walking became an exploration rather than a commute. Eating became an interaction with sensation and texture. Sleep carried a depth that had been absent for years. Even silence was alive, charged with resonance and implication. He understood that the world had not changed. Humanity continued in its rhythms, its conflicts, its distractions, yet he moved through it differently. No longer reactive, no longer seeking to impose understanding or collect validation. The observer had departed, yet the effect of alignment remained, a quiet current flowing beneath ordinary life. Zach's presence itself became a subtle demonstration that transformation does not announce itself, that awareness, once chosen, continues without spectacle, silently shaping perception from within. He did not rush, did not broadcast, did not demand attention. He simply existed, attentive and unhurried, a human interface to something far deeper than words could contain. A threshold crossed, a life quietly altered. Zach sat in the quiet of his study, the winter light thinning through the blinds, and for the first time he did not reach for a newspaper, a phone, or a task to distract him. The world beyond the walls continued as always. But within that room, within the cadence of his breath, something had shifted irreversibly. He realized that awakening was not a sudden revelation, a set of doctrines, or a catalog of insights. It was a practice, a repeated turning of attention toward presence, toward alignment with the subtle currents of perception that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of expectation, habit, and distraction. Each thought, each feeling, each moment of stillness or motion became a brushstroke in the ongoing composition of consciousness. He thought of Jesus not as a figure to emulate from a distance, not as a bearer of parables to be interpreted, but as a teacher of mechanics, a navigator of perception, a guide pointing to dimensions of awareness that humanity had long dismissed. Every word, every action that had seemed allegorical was instead an instruction in operating the interface of reality, a map to capacities dormant within each human being. Zach understood now why so few had grasped it, why institutions had codified, simplified, and ritualized the teachings into frameworks of obedience rather than resonance. Premature access would have destabilized the unready. Only those who sought truth, without ego, without reward, without influence, could perceive the deeper structure beneath the surface. He remembered the silence before Astro appeared, the sudden light, the impossibility of presence, the unfolding layers of perception that dissolved the boundaries between self, world, and source. He recalled the discipline of attention, the witnessing of memory without distortion, the embrace of discomfort, the patient repetition of choice that transformed fear and doubt into clarity. It was not mystical, it was precise, it was functional, and it was his to continue. The choice now was simple yet profound. To move through life as he had before, unconsciously, reactive, fragmentary, or to maintain alignment, to practice attention, to let stillness and observation guide the shaping of experience. Zach understood that no one could do it for him. Astro had not saved him. Jesus had not done it for him. The universe did not intervene to correct. The opportunity had always been present, and now he was awake to it. He rose from the chair and stepped to the window, looking out over the quiet, snow-covered world. The light was changing subtly, revealing textures and depths invisible before. He breathed deliberately, feeling the interconnection of the room, the street, the distant trees, the unseen energies that threaded through all. Awareness was not completion. It was ongoing, infinite, a practice renewed with every choice, every perception, every act of presence. Jesus was not speaking in metaphors. He was describing a reality that humanity had chosen to postpone, a reality accessible to those willing to practice attention, to witness without distortion, to act without ego, and to recognize that the world was alive with layers invisible to the unobservant eye. Zach understood that the path forward was quiet, deliberate, and patient. It was his choice. It was ongoing. And in that moment, he felt it. The subtle pulse of awakening, not as knowledge, but as life itself, unfolding. This is where the story ends. Yet it is only the beginning of the practice, the continuation of perception, the ongoing alignment of human consciousness with the deeper reality that has always awaited those who choose to see.